read this book as a first-timer, you know, from that first-person perspective, and it really sold me, you know.
Great. Then I partly did my job correctly, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think a lot of people don't really know the differences between the different categories of this subculture. You know, there's gamers that play games online, there's gamers that do it in person, there's the role-playing games, but your whole quest starts with Dungeons and Dragons. And I've always heard of, you know, D&D players, but I never really knew what they did. I knew they played games, so maybe for the rest of people watching out there, you could kind of walk us through D&D, give us, you know, what's D&D? What do you do? How do you play?
Sure.
Maybe show us some of your tools.
Okay. Well, the game is, and this is a, you know, what just to back up a little bit, the game was really revolutionary when it came out in 1974. And the folks who created it, in particular, this guy Gary Gygax, who's sort of the godfather of modern role-playing games, I don't think he quite knew what he had tapped into. And what he'd really done was he transformed what was a gaming culture of tabletop war games, which people had been playing for maybe not for centuries, but certainly for decades. You have a map, you have a battle that you're sort of reenacting. There's little miniatures that represent each of the armies. Imagine Risk, you know, a game that people are pretty familiar with, but on a huger scale. And you might be reenacting a battle from World War II or a Napoleonic War or maybe a medieval battle. Well, what this guy, Gary Gygax, did, which was sort of his innovation, was to change the perspective of the person who's playing the game. They're not necessarily controlling the entire army, they're playing one individual soldier. Or they're playing, what happens if you take a medieval game, a medieval war game situation and interject a dragon, or a wizard who can throw fireballs and cast spells, or a whole legion of elvish, you know, archers or something. How does that change? So he decided to sort of switch the perspective to, you're playing a character like you might, or a person in the same way that you might be in a Monopoly game, where you're going around a board and doing things. But you're not just sort of landing on spaces and things are happening to you. You are engaging in a communal storytelling kind of experience. So if you and I were playing, and Elvis, our cameraman, was playing, if I was the dungeon master, which is sort of the referee, I might say to you, okay, you're walking down a path. It's midnight, and you see up ahead of you some glowing lights in the distance. Now, your character might be an elvish warrior. Ellis's character might be I don't know.
Halfling rogue.
Halfling
rogue.
Halfling rogue. Okay, so which is kind of like a thief, kind of a sneaky character. Okay, so he's a sort of hobbit, short thief character. You're kind of an elvish warrior, and
can I be a fairy?
You in the traditional Dungeons and Dragons game you can't actually.
No, but in 3.5 with templates you can be Fey-blooded. It depends on which. Yeah, I mean.
I want to be an elf.
All right, elf.
You can definitely be an elf. I mean,
okay.
What's interesting about what Gygax did was he drew upon these different the history of sort of fairy magic in Western culture. So he kind of stole a little bit from Tolkien, he stole a little bit from King Arthur, he stole a little bit from Norse and Icelandic mythology, he stole from just folklore, fairies, leprechauns, whatever, will-o'-the-wisps, you know, things that go bump in the night, you know, people's understanding of monsters, trolls, you know, all these things that we hear in fairy tales. But he devised a gaming system where you could actually determine outcomes based on what you would say. And what's wonderful for me as a reflecting back on this experience of this game that I played, you know, every Friday night from basically 5 p.m. to 11 p.m. from 7th grade to senior year in high school. It's a huge part of my, you know, social life. Is that every Friday night we participated in this sort of group storytelling. So we'd have someone like me who was the dungeon master, and I would ask you these questions, and then you might say, okay, I explore, I'm curious, I walk closer, and then I say, well, actually what you see is this 7-foot-tall character with pointy ears. He's wearing a suit of chainmail. He's got sort of a green skin. He's holding a huge morning star, and he kind of grumbles at you and says, you know, friend or foe? And then I say to you, what do you do?
And then I can I make him disappear, or can I disappear?
You
or
could
can I
possibly.
run away?
If you were an elvish wizard or magic user, you might be able to say, okay, I'm going to cast an invisibility spell on myself, and I'm going to run around behind him and get out of his way. Or you might say, I'm going to say to him, my character, whose name is whatever her name is, Took. Okay, say her name is Took. You know,
Yes.
might say, I choose to take out my longsword and beat the crap out of him. And then what would happen is, based on the way the game works, there's a series of rules, and depending on the rule system, which are all, there's no point really going to the minutia of that, but you would roll a die, and I have this is my bag of dice from back in the day, and you might have a gaming board. You can also use miniatures to represent what your characters might be doing, which is also an innovation that is a relatively recent innovation. We're not going to find a character that's quite like what yours looks like here. This is an old metal one. This is actually a little thief, a little hobbit thief, a little halfling thief. But you would roll based on a rule, based on your agility or your skill as a warrior and the skills of this opponent. There would be a certain number that you need to make. So you would roll a die, and based on what you got, you would either strike this person with your sword or miss, or you'd cast a spell and the creature would be affected by the spell or wouldn't be affected by the spell. Based on, again, the weird part about Dungeons and Dragons is it's a highly fantastical world full of magical, mysterious scenarios and creatures that paradoxically adhere to this very geeky sort of engineering, computer science, brain type behavior that's predictable based on charts and graphs and kind of outcomes. So it's an interesting idea, and I think for a lot of kids, a lot of teenagers, and this is where my personal story comes in, when the world, the adult world, seems beyond your comprehension. Adolescence is hard to navigate for many people anyway. And if the rules of how to become an adult or how to find achievement are unclear. Here's a game where you have a very clear idea of how to succeed and how not to succeed. And if you were a geeky kid like me, where you felt essentially as powerful as like a 3-foot hobbit on the basketball team, which is to say, utterly powerless, I was not a jock, I was not part of the popular crowd, I was not going to be on any sporting team or invited to any of the cool parties or hang out with the cool kids. I needed something to do, just like every teenage boy needs something to do. And this game, magically sort of found me. And here was something I could do with my buddies every Friday night. And I think that a lot of people who have misconceptions about games, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or other games, modern versions like World of Warcraft, which is an online game which is played through the internet, they feel like, oh, this is only for a certain kind of person, or it makes you antisocial, or it somehow is going to corrupt your mind, or it's only for geeks, What people forget is that there is a whole subset of people on this earth who don't have the ability to be successful in traditional ways. And so here's a game where you can not only have fun and move up through this sort of series of tasks and quests that the games give you, but there's something that you can do with your friends. It's fun, that actually makes you social. If you knew me in high school, I was very shy and very introverted. Having a conversation with a girl was like enormously, frightening experience for me. Anything that involved me kind of being assertive and giving an interview, standing up in front of a class to give a book report, it was mortifying. But this was a game that allowed me to socialize with guys that I felt totally comfortable with, who got it.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to me because